Becoming the very epitome of the art-deco steam age, the Gresley A4 Pacific class locomotives of the LNER were a perfect mixture of style and substance, being just as formidable mechanically as they were cosmetically, and thus able to marry speed and reliability with an aesthetic that still looks good even today. The history of the A4s begins with the railway company for which they were built, the London and North Eastern Railway or LNER, one of the big four railway firms that had been created as part of the Railways Act of 1921, merging the Great Eastern Railway, Great Central Railway, Great Northern Railway, Great North of Scotland Railway, Hull and Barnsley Railway, North British Railway, and North Eastern Railway into a single entity. While the LNER's primary income during the 1920s and 30s was through freight operations, specifically coal traffic in Yorkshire, North East England and Scotland, the company also prided itself on the provision of both high-density commuter and top-line expresses up and down the eastern spine of the UK, with the face of the firm being its lavishly appointed long-distance trains between London and Scotland. To complement the LNER's passenger operations, especially at the height of the Art Deco era of the Roaring Twenties, the company placed a major slant on image, with their new services comprised of stylistic trains that were the cream of rail travel, the management fully aware that, even if these services were forced to run at a loss, image was the key to being the primary passenger service north out of London. While the LNER, much like the rival LMS on the West Coast, faced bankruptcy in the wake of the 1929 Great Depression, when their freight contracts rapidly diminished, the company continued to court innovative design practices to ensure it was truly a market leader, much of the technical prowess of the LNER stemming from its chief mechanical engineer Sir Nigel Gresley. Gresley, who had originally joined the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway as an apprentice in the late 1800s, came to the Great Northern Railway in 1905, succeeding Henry A. Ivett as chief mechanical engineer, Gresley designing 11 individual classes of locomotive with the company, including the 536 Class 060 freight engine, the H3 Mixed Traffic 260, the N2 Suburban Tank, the O2 280 freight engine, and the A1 Express passenger locomotive. With the LNER, his engineering success continued with the likes of the P1 Mikado freight engine, the U1 articulated Garrett, the J38 freight engine, the B17 passenger engine, the P2 Express passenger engine, the K4 passenger locomotive for the West Highland line, and early prototypes of what would later be the EM1 electric locomotive for the Woodhead route. Of note was Gresley's rebuilding of his own original Great Northern Railway A1 class to improve their performance through the fitting of a higher boiler pressure, the fruits of his labour becoming the Class A3 of 1928, of which was included the venerable 4472 Flying Scotsman. Going into the 1930s, Gresley would take a keen interest in the development of high-speed diesel multiple units for express trains in both Europe and the United States, of specific interest being the Deutsche Reichsbahn's Class SVT 877 of 1933, also known as the Fliegende Hamburger or Flying Hamburger, a 99-mile-an-hour diesel railcar that operated express services between Berlin and Hamburg. To observe the changes in railway technology, Gresley travelled to Germany and took a ride on the Fliegende Hamburger, being impressed by its performance, but noting that, while it was imperative for streamlining to be installed on frontline steam locomotives, these trains would only operate most efficiently at the highest possible speeds. Initially, Gresley envisaged a diesel unit as per the Fliegende Hamburger, which, through early calculations, could undertake the 268-mile London to Newcastle run in 4.5 hours, but upon further research, determined that performance similar to that of the diesel railcar could be achieved through a modernised version of his preceding A3 Pacific class steam locomotive. Therefore, in association with the National Physical Laboratory, Gresley was able to develop a streamlined body shell that could be neatly placed on the underpinnings of an A3, while the performance of his Pacific designs in delivering power that easily matched the flying hamburger were proven during a series of trials using his Class A1 locomotives, which attained a new world record for steam traction of 108 miles an hour. Utilizing 1472 Flying Scotsman, which was still in its original guise as an A1, and rebuilt Class A3 2750 Papyrus, Flying Scotsman propelled itself into the pages of history by reaching over 100 miles an hour on November 30, 1934, the first steam locomotive to be officially authenticated at this speed, followed by Papyrus illustrating the improvements of the A3 conversion when it reached 108 miles an hour while hauling 12 coaches. The success of these trial runs was all the incentive the LNER Board of Directors needed to give Gresley approval, and thus he devised the Silver Jubilee trains, so named in conjunction with the Silver Jubilee of King George V, the concept being for a completely streamlined train set of locomotive and coaches, with balances between the bogies and flexible covers on the ends of the coaches to improve aerodynamics. The full articulated 7-car train set had a capacity of 198 passengers and comprised of 3 sections, a twin-articulated brake third, triple-articulated restaurant set, and a twin-articulated first class, while for the locomotive, Gresley took inspiration from the streamlined styling of the Autorail Bugatti, a series of aerodynamic 2-car rail motors built for the French railways. The design of Gresley's locomotive was assisted by Professor William Dolby, who provided the wind tunnel facilities at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, which allowed Gresley to determine how to direct smoke away from the cab, smoke deflectors being initially considered, but after a number of trials, he found that none of the designs he proposed would push smoke clear of the cab. The solution came quite by accident, as during further tests on the plasticine scale model, Gresley noticed that someone had inadvertently left a thumb indentation on the body just behind the chimney, and desperate for a solution, Gresley ran another test with this blemish in situ, and incredibly it solved the problem, blowing smoke well clear of the cab. Although the general underpinnings of this new locomotive class were based almost entirely on the A3, there were some notable changes to improve the design, with the boiler pressure being increased from 220 psi to 250 psi, and the cylinders being decreased slightly in size so that the valve diameters could be increased to 9 inches, producing free steaming within the restrictions of the 3-cylinder design. Additional refinements included the Carl-Chap double blast pipe exhaust and Westinghouse QSA brake valves, but these were only placed onto the later production models as the design was improved incrementally. The first of Gresley's new Class A4 Pacific locomotives, built at LNER's works in Doncaster, ran a demonstration train from London King's Cross to Grantham on September 27, 1935, reaching a top speed of 112.5 miles an hour. The locomotive, 2509 Silver Link, and its matching articulated set of 7 coaches, commencing revenue-earning service on October 1st, followed by 3 other classmates with their own rakes of dedicated coaches. The Silver Jubilee Express trains were an instant hit among the travelling public, shaving the journey time between London and Newcastle down to a mere 4 hours. The commercial success of the Silver Jubilee leading the LNER to order 5 additional A4 locomotives from the Doncaster works, these being 4482 to 4486. The first of these new engines, 4482, emerged from the Doncaster works in December 1936, and from 1937, A4s were now operating fast services between London and Hull, creating the world's first high-speed intercity rail network, the order increasing further from the original 5, plus the 4 Silver Jubilee engines, with an additional 26 locomotives being added to the fleet, bringing the total number of A4s to 35 by 1938. With demand now exceeding supply to ride the Silver Jubilee, these train sets were extended to 8 coaches from February 1938, and A4s were placed onto an increasingly wide variety of top-line expresses, illustrating their innate flexibility. Outside of Silver Jubilee services, the most notable train on the LNER was the Coronation, which was introduced on July 5, 1937, and was named to commemorate the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. The train, usually hauled by a Garter Blue A4 Pacific, comprising of 8 coaches made up of 2 articulated 4-car sets, and operated between London and Edinburgh. Aside from wearing a distinctive 2-tone blue livery, The train also featured an observation carriage at the rear, dubbed the Beaver Tail, while the third train to consist of articulated coaches, the West Riding Limited, began on September 27, 1937, operating between London, Leeds and Bradford, and was hauled by 4492 Dominion of New Zealand on its inaugural run. Such was the reliability of these engines that in the 1,952 runs of the Silver Jubilee, there were only 10 occasions where a mechanical issue with the A4 was noted, while at the same time, these operations were incredibly safe, with no reported accidents or incidents occurring during the life of the Silver Jubilee service. Even for engine crews, the A4s were superb locomotives to drive, with a spacious cab, smooth ride, and performance that could easily power the toughest loads, though while the A4s were the fate of rail travel in the 1930s, they still hadn't obtained the coveted record for fastest steam locomotive. On May 11, 1936, Deutsche Reichsbahn's Class A4 05002 took home the record after achieving a speed of 124.5 miles an hour on the Berlin to Hamburg main line while hauling a 197-ton train, the LNER responding by preparing a special run with locomotive 2512 Silver Fox, by then the newest member of the class to be built, in order to try and beat this record. Fitted with a dynamometer car, the trial operated between Newcastle and London and was driven by George Henry Haygreen, who had originally pushed Silverlink to 112 miles an hour on the Silver Jubilee inaugural run, but problems emerged due to the management failing to tell Haygreen he was meant to be trying to beat the Class A5's record, and thus, upon reaching Stoke Bank in Lincolnshire, he had not the speed or boiler pressure to attempt the record. While he was able to force the engine to a top speed of 113 miles an hour with what steam he had available, the engine's middle big end suffered damage and it eventually limped into King's Cross 7 minutes late. While this trial run failed to break any records, it did illustrate that the A4s had a reserve of power, and thus would be suitable to operate 10-coach trains on a planned Glasgow-London service, while further adding to the woes of the LNER, the rival LMS took home the record for fastest British steam locomotive at 114 miles an hour with one of their streamlined Coronation Pacifics. For the record-breaking run, Pioneer Coronation Pacific No. 6220 Coronation hauled a special train between London and Crewe, attaining its maximum speed of 114 miles an hour just south of its destination, though this nearly ended in disaster when it entered the yard complex at Crewe too fast and swerved over the points at speed, sending passengers tumbling and glassware and fine china smashing to the carriage floor. Again, the LNER tried to beat both the British and world record, this time on the inaugural run of the new Coronation service with 4489 Dominion of Canada at the helm, but this only achieved 109.5 miles an hour while coming down Stoke Bank, these various runs making Gresley aware of the need for a modified braking system in order to safely slow the train from its high-speed trials, proposing the use of a Westinghouse design as per the LMS. On July 3, 1938, a train was assembled for the Westinghouse team to test their braking system on, the consist being made up of 6 coaches and the 1906-built Northeastern Railway dynamometer car, while power came in the form of the 4-month-old A4 Pacific 4468 Mallard, as driven by J. Duddington, a Doncaster-based engineman who had established a reputation for driving locomotives hard. However, what was booked as a test for the Westinghouse brakes soon became a run for the world speed record, and after an initial run north from London to Grantham to test the braking system, the train was turned and made the journey south again, this time attempting to achieve the record before arrival at Peterborough. Passing Stoke signal box at 74 miles an hour, the train's speed increased rapidly, and soon it had broken the LMS's record by attaining 116 miles an hour at milepost 94, with the dynamometer car recording a maximum drawbar of 1,800 horsepower, while between milepost 92 and milepost 89, the train reached 120 miles an hour, and for a mere 306 yards, Mallard broke 125 miles an hour, bringing home the world record for steam traction. Arriving into Peterborough, the engine crew found that the engine's centre bearing had overheated and partially melted, and thus in order to meet the gathered press in London, it had to be towed behind an Ivet Atlantic, though fortunately, the repair work to the locomotive was easily accomplished, and 9 days later, Mallard was steaming in revenue-earning service once again as the fastest steam locomotive in the world. Gresley, certain that the A4s could achieve 130 miles an hour if pushed further, prepared to undertake another run during September 1939, but his plans were put on hold indefinitely when war between Britain and Germany was declared on September 3rd of that year, thus bringing an abrupt end to the glamorous golden era of trains and streamlined services on the LNER. With the enactment of the Emergency Powers Defence Act by Parliament the previous month, as many resources as possible were dedicated to the war effort, including the start of evacuation trains for children in the cities being shipped out to the countryside to avoid the threat of air raids, the final Silver Jubilee, Coronation and West Riding Limited services being undertaken on August 31st, 1939, never to return. During wartime, the A4s were painted black as an austerity measure, in common with other express locomotives, and were designated part of the Northeast region, though during the course of the war, only one A4 locomotive would be lost, despite the devastating and near-constant aerial bombardment received by the LNER's network, that engine being 4469 Sir Ralph Wedgwood. On the night of April 28, 1942, 4469 was undergoing repairs at York's North Shed, now the National Railway Museum, when the Luftwaffe commenced an air raid on the city, during which the station and the North Shed were struck, with one bomb falling through the roof of the engine house and landing between 4469 and B-16 freight locomotive number 925, blowing both engines apart. What was left of 4469 was subsequently scrapped, but the tender was recovered and eventually paired with LNER Thompson Class A2/1, number 3696 Highland Chieftain. But other than 4469's untimely demise, the class generally survived the war unscathed, but worn out and severely under-maintained as per the rest of the UK railway network. With the Big Four essentially bankrupt and the railway system in tatters, Parliament chose nationalisation as the solution, forming a new state-owned rail operator dubbed British Railways, which came into effect from January 1st, 1948, and would inject public money into the repair and modernisation of the rail network going into the 1950s. During the same year as British Railways' formation, the company undertook a series of trials in order to determine the most successful locomotive designs of the former Big Four railway companies, these trials seeing engines of the LMS, LNER, Great Western and Southern exchanged onto their rivals' territory to see how they compared with regard to performance. The A4s produced some good results and had the lowest coal and water consumption figure of any express locomotive, but were unfortunately not immune to failures, mostly stemming from their conjugated motion, a feature that, while excellent in many ways, only worked its best when well maintained, something that these engines had lacked during the war. Back on the former LNER routes out of King's Cross, attempts to restart non-stop expresses in the summer of 1948 were hampered by flooding, which collapsed several bridges along the route of the East Coast Main Line in southeast Scotland, forcing the diversion of services via Selby, Leeds, and the Settle and Carlisle, before heading back towards Edinburgh via the Waverley route through Hawick. It was in this that on August 24, 1948, 60028 Walter K. Wigham, on its first run, managed to travel non-stop from Edinburgh to King's Cross via Hawick, Carlisle, Settle, Leeds and Selby, a new record-setting distance of 408.65 miles, this record only being beaten by 4472 Flying Scotsman when it ran 422 miles non-stop in August 1989 while on tour in Australia. Gradually, as the former route of the LNER, now designated the eastern and northeastern regions of British Railways, was revitalised, speeds began to improve, but never reached their pre-war peak, while in 1955, British Railways drafted the Modernisation Plan, a scheme in which steam power would be replaced by the widespread adoption of diesel and electric traction. Initially, electrification of the East Coast Main Line, similar to the West Coast Main Line, was proposed, with a fleet of 100-mile-an-hour AC electric locomotives to be introduced, but it was found that, in light of BR's limited budget, attempting to modify the roof at King's Cross Station would be cost-prohibitive. Diesel power was therefore considered, which came to a head in the form of English Electric's prototype DP1, a diesel locomotive fitted with two Napier-Deltic marine engines from the Hunt-class minesweeper, DP1 having originally been developed for the West Coast Main Line, but following its dismissal from the route, the orphaned engine would instead undergo trials between 1957 and 1961 out of King's Cross. DP1 would subsequently provide superb performance during its short career with British Railways, and would pave the way for an order of 22 production Deltic locomotives, later designated Class 55, which would be the first diesel locomotives to run at a sustained 100 miles an hour in the UK. As Deltics began to appear from 1961, the first A4s to be withdrawn were 60003 Andrew K. McCosh, 60014 Silver Link, 60028 Walter K. Wigham, 60030 Golden Fleece, and 60033 Seagull. These engines being taken out of service in December 1962, followed in 1963 by a further 10 locomotives, 7 in 1964, and 6 in 1965. As Deltics and brush-type 4s took over on top expresses, compounded further by the closure of King's Cross Shed to steam in 1964, the service patterns for the A4s were pushed gradually north, until eventually the final few stragglers were working exclusively on expresses between Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen, as well as parcels trains and the occasional freight service. Nevertheless, even in their final years, the A4s could still illustrate their exceptional speed in service, with May 23, 1959, seeing 60007 Sir Nigel Gresley achieve 112 miles an hour while hauling the Stevenson Locomotive Society Golden Jubilee Special down Stoke Bank, when driver Bill Hall attempted to break Mallard's record, but was dissuaded from doing so due to the possible safety risks. Despite their relegation to the far north of Scotland, these locomotives still proved their worth on the Aberdeen to Glasgow run, shaving half an hour off the 3.5-hour journey time, though regardless, the curtain for the A4s had to fall, and by 1966 only 6 members of the class remained in service, these being 60004 William Whitlaw, 60007 Sir Nigel Gresley, 60009 Union of South Africa, 60019 Bittern, 6024 Kingfisher, and 6034 Lord Farringdon. Bittern had the honour of working the last A4 powered train under British Railways, that being a service from Glasgow to Aberdeen on September 3, 1966, the locomotive having been so poorly maintained by this point that it was only able to operate thanks to light last-minute repairs. In total, of the 35 locomotives built, only 6 have been saved for preservation, together with a few sundry items. Those locomotives that survived the scrapyard being 60007 Sir Nigel Gresley, 60008 Dwight D. Eisenhower, 60009 Union of South Africa, 60010 Dominion of Canada, 60019 Bittern, and 6022 Mallard. Of these, 4 remain in the UK, while 60008 Dwight D. Eisenhower was donated to the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and 60010 Dominion of Canada was donated to the Canadian Railway Museum in Montreal, while Mallard was restored to its as-built condition and number and placed on static display at the National Railway Museum in York as the first A4 to enter preservation. However, for a short period between July 1986 and 1988, the engine was returned to working order and operated a series of rail tours between York and Scarborough, as well as York to Leeds via Harrogate, while on July 3, 1988, for the 50th anniversary of its record-breaking run, this was celebrated by a round trip from Doncaster via York, Harrogate and Leeds in conjunction with prototype Class 89 89001. One of its final rail tours was the Postal Pullman, as sponsored by the Post Office, which ran between London Marylebone and Banbury and drew a significant crowd, after which the engine returned to the life of a static display. In 2013, to commemorate the 75th anniversary of Mallard's record-breaking run, Bittern was given special permission by Network Rail to operate above the 75-mile-an-hour speed limit for steam locomotives on the main line, hauling 3 special charter trains throughout the summer at 90 miles an hour, with June 29th seeing the engine break the speed record for a preserved British steam locomotive when it attained 92.8 miles an hour near Arlesey in Bedfordshire. On December 7th, Bittern broke its own record by reaching 93 miles an hour on the Tees Tyne Streak, a record that would stand until April 12, 2017, when Peppercorn Class A1 replica number 60163 Tornado broke 101.6 miles an hour during a test run on the East Coast Main Line, the first British steam engine to reach 100 miles an hour since 1967. Today, of the 6 preserved A4s, only 4498 Sir Nigel Gresley remains in working order, though other examples have steamed in preservation aside from Mallard, including the aforementioned 4464 Bittern and 4488 Union of South Africa, both of which were withdrawn due to the expiry of their boiler tickets, with the former being prepared for a return to steam, while the latter is to remain a static exhibit. Perhaps the most notable event the A4s have seen in preservation was when all 6 classmates were reunited between 2012 and 2013 as part of the Great Gathering, with 60008 Dwight D. Eisenhower and 60010 Dominion of Canada returning to their UK home for the first time since the 1960s, this event being organised by the National Railway Museum and was a unique opportunity to see all 6 surviving locomotives side by side once again. To summarise, the Gresley A4 Pacifics have obtained their legendary status in the annals of railway history for long justified reasons, as aside from the achievement of Mallard in breaking and maintaining the world speed record for steam traction, the class also proved itself to be a reliable, powerful and flexible series of engines that could work all manner of trains throughout their working lives. However, their most identifiable trait is their streamlined styling, which even after nearly a century since their first introduction in the 1930s, is still a quintessential part of the Art Deco styling that was once a global zeitgeist, and was perhaps the final testament to true luxury and aesthetics prior to the dark days of World War II, maintaining a proud and timeless image that harkens back to a long-departed period of yesteryear.